Welcome to another lecture discussion on the course Introduction to Government and Politics for external students at the University of Papua New Guinea, taking the course Introduction to Government and Politics. In this discussion, we are going to talk about Unit 7, the types of political system, and we are going to look at the different types of political system we have and look at Aristotle's classification in trying to explain these types of political systems. The objectives of the discussion here, there are three of them, which is found on page 52 of your study guide. The first one, the discussion tries to explain Aristotle's classification for classifying political systems, and then from there we'll be trying to look at the modern typologies to describe a political system, and there are three modern typologies that we will be discussing, and then we'll outline and look at different types of political regimes in the modern world that we have today. Now, if you care to turn to page 52 or rather 53 of your study guide, you would have noticed the classifications, Aristotle's classification. For Aristotle, his view or his emphasis of his classification is into two phases or two dimensions. The first one is who rules, and the second one is who benefits. Now these two classification is important here, so we tend to see the relationship between who rules and who benefits. Whether this relationship results in a genuine form which benefits both dimensions or both parties, those who rules and those who benefits, and whether this relationship tend to result in perverted form, where you have mostly those who benefits tend to get most of the resources or benefit from the relationship. So here, Aristotle typology, when he talks about who rules, he is talking about, let's say, the number of people involved in the task of governing. Okay, so refers to the ruling class, okay, those individuals that are in power. And when he talks about those who benefits, this is referring to whether the rulers or those who rules govern tend to govern in the common interests or in the interest of a few. So in the common interest, that would be genuine rule, and in the interest of few, okay, that would be perverted. And if you look at page 53 of your book, it has a diagram into differentiating those the perverted and the genuine rule, but I won't be looking at them. What I'm interested in is this idea or notion of the two dimensions. So the relationship, we will be looking at the relationship between those who rules and those who benefit from the rule or from the government. Okay, now Aristotle, okay, we can see that the relationship between those who rules and who benefits can be seen in, for example, in the feudal structure in Europe, the feudal era, kings and queens, okay, in an what is called the aristocracy society or aristocratic society. The real ruling class, okay, who are typically the wealthy or the noble and governs, and they aim to benefit themselves. In contrast, in a democracy, power rests with the people, and the government is meant to benefit the citizens. Okay, so the government has the power. So the government now falls into this idea of the rulership. Okay, the government rules, and the people benefits. Okay, so this idea here, that we will be using to further classify the different types of political system. So when we talk about different types of political system, we have to ensure that we understand Aristotle's classification. Okay, those who rules versus those who benefits. Now, in looking at that or staying in that discussion of who rules and who benefits, we will further discuss the relationship between who rules and who governs through what is called the modern typologies. Okay, what are the modern typologies? Okay, this is useful, okay, for classifying modern governments. Okay, the modern governments that we have can be classified into these three typologies. Now remember, coming from Aristotle's classification, there are two dimensions: those who rules and those who benefit. Okay, the rule that tend to benefit the common interest of all tend to be genuine, and the rule that does not benefit the common interest of all tend to be perverted. Okay, and for example, here in an aristocracy rule, that is a perverted form of governing, and in a democracy rule there is a genuine form of governing, for example. But here there are three typologies. We are looking at relationship. Now the first typology looks at the relationship between state and society. Okay, the state tend to fall in the category of who rules. Okay, state tend to rules, and the benefit tend to be the society. Okay, so when we look at that in the first typology, state-society relationship, we tend to focus on the government. Okay, and the classification is based on the relationship between the state and the society. In a authoritarian regimes, countries like North Korea, South Korea, or Saudi Arabia, okay, the state exercise significant control over society, and this often limiting civil liberties and political participation. Okay, you can say in an authoritarian regimes, those who benefit, okay, tend to, or those who rule tend to have overriding control over those who benefit, okay, the society. So Aristotle must classify that as a perverted rule or rulership, because it benefits only those that are in authority. Okay, and in a democratic system, power is derived from and accountable to the people, with institutions designed to protect individuals' rights, promote political participation. Okay, according to Aristotle, then those who rule the established democratic system tend to benefit those who in society, for example. So Aristotle will say that in a democratic society, the relationship is genuine. Now, examples are authoritarian regimes include North Korea and Saudi Arabia, where those who benefits, okay, or the relationship tend to be perverted. Those in power or authority tend to have their way, okay, say in the society. Okay, they are more commanding over the society. So there is an unequal or balance of relationship between state and society. By saying that for democratic society, there is a balance, okay, in the relationship. Okay, so there is one way, the state and society relationship, in looking at the classification of political system. Okay, the second would be the executive legislative relationship, and that's particularly moving towards the representative form of democracy, where you have the presidential system or the parliamentary system. We may argue that parliamentary system is better because it represents the majority, or presidential system is better because it represents the majority. Depending on the argument here, the Aristotle classification of who rules and who benefits comes to play. So for example, in the executive legislative relationship, governments are categorized based on the distribution of power between executive and the legislative. So should presidential or a presidential system is good, or parliamentary system is good, okay, or perverted or genuine for that matter. In a presidential system, the executive government, the president and the legislative branch, the Congress, are separate and independent. Okay? In a parliamentary system, the executive and the prime minister is part of the legislative branch and is accountable to it. Okay? Examples include presidential system in the United States and Brazil, while parliamentary system include the United Kingdom and Germany. Okay, now important here is that the chief distinction in this dimension, okay, between executive and the legislature, okay, between parliamentary could be between parliamentary and presidential system. Okay, so let's look at the next one is centralization and decentralization. Okay, why is this important? So governments could be classified according to their degree of centralization or decentralization. The major types of this dimension can be in the, for example, centralization, unitary state, or devolved state, the federal state, and confederation. So centralization, decentralization is a significant issue for modern state, although it was not relevant to Aristotle, who was considering small government, then that was the size of the larger city. So for example, here we see that whether centralization is good for our political system, or decentralization is good for our political system. And we look at the idea of who rules and who benefits here. Okay, so in a centralization, power is concentrated at the national level with little autonomy granted to lower levels of the government. In a decentralization, power is dispersed among local or regional entities. Okay, you may say that in a centralization, system is perverted, meaning that though the rulers, those who are in power in the government, tend to have more say over the society. Or in a decentralization, those that are, okay, the local autonomy, the local regions have more say on the decision making of the society. Okay, so in federal systems like the United States, power is divided between the national government and the state government, allowing for decentralized decision making on certain issues like education and health. Okay, so here the three typologies. Okay, let's just go through the three typologies before we look at political regimes. Important here is that whether these relationships, okay, who rules and who benefits, translate into genuine good or perverted bad. So in modern typology, we can see that relationship between by looking at the state and society. Okay, in an authoritarian state, those that are in power tends to be benefit from or have or more power over the society. In a democratic system, those that are in society tend to have more power than the state. Okay, depending on where you sit in terms of your understanding of the topic, okay, or where you sit, whether you agree between by state having more power, or you agree where society having more power. You agree with authoritarian regimes, or you agree with democratic regimes. Same can be said between executive and the legislative. Whether you agree that presidential system, the executive has more power over the legislative, or the parliamentary system where the executive is part of the legislative. Okay, whether you disagree to agree, okay, the issue or the important issue here is that whether this type of typologies, okay, is genuine or perverted, depending on a case-by-case basis. Here again, whether centralization or decentralization, you look at the power and see whether you have perverted or genuine. Okay, whether more decentralization tend to benefit the people, or more centralization tend to benefit the state. Okay, now when looking at political regimes, okay, political regimes refer to the types of governing system in different countries. Okay, now various political regimes exist worldwide, each with its unique characteristics and governing principles. And understanding this regime help us analyze, let's say, the global political dynamics and the governing structure. Okay, now let's look at now mind you, okay, we still trying to look at these different regimes with Aristotle's view on who rules and who benefits, and also in addition to that with our understanding on the modern typology, the state and society relationship, the legislative and the executive relationship, and the central versus decentralization relationship. Okay, now according to our discussion here on page 56, there should be about 5 types of regimes mentioned here. Okay, the first one is what is called the Western polyarchies. Okay, now this type of regimes, okay, are characterized by a relatively high tolerance of political opposition and wide-ranging opportunities for general population to participate in the political process. So here, the state and society relationship tends to favor those the people in terms of their participation in the process, and that favors most of the democratic or democracies in Western European countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea also. The passive nature of power being established or enshrined and supported, or this notion of government by the people for the people. Okay, so Western polyarchy is characterized by competitive elections, political pluralism, and protection of civil liberties, ensuring a high degree of political participation and accountability. So these regimes, okay, supports the idea of democracy. Now when we look at the post-communist regimes, okay, these are former communist regimes that are undergoing a process of democratization and market liberalization, okay, that draws heavily upon the ideology of Western liberalism. So these are the countries that are in transition, you can say, from communist rule into a democratic rule. Okay, examples are Ukraine, okay, Poland, some parts of Russia. Okay, and an emphasis on transitioning, okay, countries transitioning from communist rule, okay, towards democratization and market reforms. Okay, the next is the East Asian regimes. Okay, now in East Asian regimes, okay, they tend to share similar characteristics that differentiate them from Western regimes. So East Asian regimes are oriented more around economic development, okay, rather than political objectives such as individual freedom. Okay, you have countries, okay, like China, for example. They have, although it is regarded as communist China, but China in itself has opened its market or adopted these market reforms. So they are more about economic development than pursuing the political ideologies, okay, such as individual freedom, okay, etc., etc. So most of these, let's say, East Asian regimes are authoritarian in nature. Okay, they have strong state control and emphasis on economic development. Okay, so examples are China, North Korea, Vietnam, okay, or even Japan before World War II. And after World War II, you have a strong state control, okay, in Japan and South Korea. Okay, so this falls under the East Asian regimes. And the next is Islamic regimes, okay, or rather combined Islamic and military regimes. Islamic regimes are are grounded in Islam, which is not simply a religion but a way of life that defines correct moral, political, and economic behavior for individuals and nations alike. Okay, so governance is influenced by Islamic law. Okay, varying degree of political freedoms, but very much is guided by the Islamic law. Okay, and we have the military regimes. So military regimes are political systems where the leading posts in the government are filled on the basis of the person's position in the military chain of command. So military regimes are ruled by military leaders and often through coup d'etat, limited civil liberties. And examples would be Egypt, okay, Fiji before transitioning, okay, Fiji's in 2000, for example, under Komodo Bainimarama. Okay, so here when you look at this political system, different political system, for example, you look at state and society relationship. Let's look at state and society relationship. In a Western polarchy system, you can see the society tends to be more command more power through competitive elections, political pluralism, and protection of civil liberties. In post-communist regimes, okay, state and society relationship, okay, it's a bit difficult to ascertain, okay, meaning that they are in transition and more or less state tend to be control of most of these regimes here, or most of the say in governance. In East Asian regime, the state tends to be more control over the society. In an Islamic regime, the state tend to be more control over the society, and in military regime, the state tend to be more control over the society. And the second classification is the executive and the legislative. The executive and the legislative, let's say, I think it belongs, it can be found in most of the Western polarchies. Okay, not so much, yep, post-communist regime would be, but not so much on East Asian regime, Islamic and military regimes. In the third category, centralization and decentralization, or third typologies, Western polarchy, you can say, would would advocate for a centralized form of government, whereas you have, okay, mix, okay, in post-communist regime, more moving towards advocating more decentralization form, but not so too much of East Asian regime, because they would advocate for more centralization, okay, power to the state, and to a certain degree, or in addition, included or would be Islamic regime and military regime. Okay, so in conclusion, so what we are trying to do in these different types of classification is to classify different political system. Okay, so understanding different political system enhance our comprehension of the global structure. The various factors include historical context, cultural influence, and economic condition. This shape, okay, the degree of relationship between the state and society, central decentralization, or the executive and the legislature. Okay, so here we started off by looking at the idea of who Aristotle's classification on who rules and who benefits. Okay, when we establish that, then we look at the three typologies, okay, the relationship, state society relationship, executive legislative relationship, and centralization decentralization relationship. And then we look at an overview and how those relationships tend to come into play in trying to classify the different types of regimes that we have in the world, in the global political environment today. Okay, So with that, this conclude our lecture discussion for unit 7, which is type of political system, and we will be discussing unit 8, which is democracy, in the next lecture discussion video.